The annals of the late century record a paradox. When scribes trace the inflection points that steered the kingdoms away from permanent sundering and toward the uneasy continuities that followed the storms, they repeatedly encounter the decisions of a man better remembered for restraint than for audacity. Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, did not cultivate glory. He husbanded strength. He did not declaim, he documented. He did not cut problems to size with a sword. He arranged them in a ledger and starved them of oxygen until they shrank. Yet, assembled as a continuous chronicle and studied with the comparative eye usually reserved for kings and conquerors, his portfolio of choices tallies into a sequence of masterstrokes whose effects radiate decades beyond his life. Seen against the bristling clutter of lords who mistook spectacle for statecraft, the quiet in his method becomes legible as design. The apprenticeship explains the method. Fostered in the Vale under Jon Arryn, he learned from a lord whose genius lay not in rousing speeches, but in the cultivation of trust networks across hills and harbors. Training among Arryn's stewards, Eddard internalized that logistics precedes banners, and that the harvest ledger is more candid than any oath. He watched convoys in the high roads, measured how a single late barge could stagger a garrison's winter allotment, learned that a lord who pays on time keeps horses that do not founder. In the Vale he acquired not only a friend in Robert Baratheon but a habit of weighing men by whether they could be relied upon to appear where they said they would, with the victuals they promised, in the weather they had not chosen. The friendships that mattered later were not at feasts but at musters. Returning north as second son and, after tragedy, as lord, he took custody of a jurisdiction whose history had taught brutal lessons about endurance. The North bleeds distance into every undertaking. The map itself enforces prudence. He did not try to refit it to southern tempos. He built policy around terrain. Garrison rotations at the bottlenecks were maintained with numbing regularity. Moat Cailin was treated not as an antique ruin but as an instrument. Repair schedules for its towers were synchronized with road crews along the causeways so that the stones would have the draft animals they needed at the time they needed them. Winterfell's glass gardens, warmed by the vein of heat beneath, became not curiosities but a hedge against failed harvests. The household accounts show an intentional surplus of preserved greens set aside each autumn for distribution to holdfasts within a day's ride. A small investment whose payoff was political as much as nutritional. Food moved outward with the same reliability as summonses moved inward. Lords remember who fed their small folk in a lean year. Their heirs inherit the memory. The northern levy structure under him stabilized. Muster rolls from Deepwood Motte and Barrowton, preserved in copies by maesters who admired tidy hands, show steady troop counts year to year, modestly adjusted for bad summers but never rated for vanity projects. He did not drain his vassals to gild his hall. He measured his authority by the absence of debt and panic. It is not romantic material, which is why singers ignored it. It is the ground on which his later decisions stood without wobbling. When war came in the form of royal madness and royal demands, his response obeyed these habits. The executions in King's Landing extinguished not simply his kin but the normal bargaining channels between crown and great houses. Aerys' summons for Jon Arryn to yield his wards was not a bid for negotiation. It was a demand for complicity. Eddard's acceptance of the Tully alliance through marriage, arranged in Grief's Draft and Duty's Ink, turned a private catastrophe into a public coalition without delay or melodrama. The political arithmetic is clearer now than it seemed amid the smoke. The union of North and Riverlands gave the rebellion not merely men but the riverine logistics the northern columns needed to cross south in fighting shape. The iron rule of campaigns, that supply governs boldness, meant that only with Tully barges and Tully mills could he gamble on speed. The crossing of the neck remains underappreciated as a piece of operational design. Contemporaneous letters from holdfast clerks complain of requisition carts and the churned roads of late spring, but their irritation is evidence of a plan executed across dozens of petty jurisdictions. Eddard's column moved in staggered packets, points of the vanguard seeding caches along the route for the heavier masses that followed. Crannogmen scouted the wet flats and delivered wayfinding in the idiom they trusted. Rumors let loose along safe mouths, then corrected at predetermined markets, then paid for with barrels of salt fish that could be traced back along the same route to test for leaks. What looks from far above like a straightforward march was, from the inside, a careful layering of redundancies so that no single failure could cause a rout of hunger. At Stony September, where Robert's luck ran thin under the net of a vigilant royalist, those logistics converted into a rescue that would recalibrate the war's momentum. The chronicles call it the Battle of the Bells for the city's alarm, but one should hear in the ringing not only panic but coordination. Eddard's contingent, lean from speed and still disciplined enough to deploy on arrival, did not attempt a grand, theatrical encirclement. They broke Cunnington's pursuit at the joints, found Robert alive, and created the conditions for the one asset they could not replace to fight again in chosen circumstances. This showed his priorities with X-ray clarity. Save the irreplaceable center of gravity. Do not squander men in a revenge rush. Stabilize lines of retreat and advance for another day. Victory in that town had more symbolic effect than material gain. But symbolic effects, when they alter the decisions of undecided lords, are as solid as stone. Houses that had waited to see whether the rebellion was a fire that would burn itself out saw instead a flame husbanded by men who did not panic. In the wake of the Trident, where Robert's hammer broke Rhaegar's line and legend while Eddard's discipline kept the levies intact, the sack of King's Landing threatened to corrupt the victory into something that would poison governance for a generation. Eddard entered the city not as an avenger but as a custodian of the rebellion's moral ledger. The dead children on the marble floors are often remembered as an offense to his personal conscience. They were also an offense to the project of rule he meant to see established. Illegitimate victory sours alliances. By refusing to bless slaughter done in his cause, he preserved enough moral credit for the new regime to be something other than a cartel. He did not keep Tywin Lannister from delivering his grisly proofs. He did succeed in making it plain that the kingship that followed would not be a Lannister franchise. Later fissures would widen that line into a canyon, but the original cut was surgical. Then came the decision whose consequences seem, in retrospect, almost impossibly farsighted. With the rebel center victorious, with the royal capital in uneasy submission, Eddard did not remain in the seat of power to nurse affronts or gorge on titles. He marched to lift the siege of Storm's End. The choice reads at first glance as loyalty to a friend of a friend. It was strategic in the highest sense. A starving Stannis Baratheon, stiff, legalistic, and loyal to obligation if not to men, represented the crucial ballast in a nascent order otherwise overly dependent on Robert's magnetism and Lannister money. If Storm's End fell by surrender, and Stannis were humiliated or killed, the rebellion's backbone would harden around expediency rather than legitimacy. Tyrell and Redwyne forces, stalled before the Citadel, could have reinvented the endgame as a negotiation among victors, leaving Robert king by Lannister grace and Tyrell indulgence. By relieving the siege, Eddard rescued not only Stannis's body but the idea that the crown rested on a claim validated by something more durable than Southern approval. He bridged Storm's End into the new settlement and made a subtle peace that reached farther than any treaty. He gave the siblings of House Baratheon a shared memory of rescue that would, for a time, bind their private resentments to public service. The later breakdown of that bond should not obscure how essential it was in the interregnum to preserve an unfractured royal house. The tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne enters this account not for romance but for statecraft. Eddard's retrieval of his sister and the newborn she entrusted to him, and his decision to encase that child in the anonymity of bastardy, saved an infant and altered the timing of a dynasty's return. The key is timing. A revealed Targaryen heir surviving the sack would have split the rebel coalition instantly and birthed a war of succession on the heels of a rebellion. By concealing the boy and absorbing the stain upon himself, he bought the realm a generation. That generation, as it happened, would produce the very constituency. Northern legions hardened by ice, riverlords desperate for stability, a mix of free folk and kneelers knitted together under a Stark, that eventually formed the spine of the alliance that faced the existential winter. One is tempted to overread intention. There is no evidence he foresaw dragons or dead men, but we do not need to conjure prophecy to respect prudence. He understood that a child alive and hidden does not destabilize a fragile peace. A child alive and declared becomes a magnet for oaths and knives alike. When later fortunes drew the hidden, the North-raised boy into leadership, the conditions were not those of a dynastic claimant demanding fealty. but those of a commander whose claim was service and whose bloodline, when revealed, fused competing loyalties rather than sorting them into camps. The original secrecy contained a catastrophe that would have burst the vessel of peace. Decades later, when its seal broke, the contents no longer destroyed their container. Back in Winterfell, the policy of the hostage was practiced not as cruelty but as insurance. After the Iron Islands rose and were beaten down, the settlement presented a choice between exemplary punishment and managed humiliation. The king roared for might. The northern lord arranged for time. Eddard took the heir of the defeated into his household, not to raise a pet but to chain a proud father to peace through love and fear in equal measure. The logic of the measure is clear in the royal court records of the day. The Ironborn would remain turbulent so long as their dignity could find a path toward vengeance. And nothing blocks such a path like the vulnerability of a child within reach of royal justice. The boy's subsequent crimes decades later stand as tragic testimony to the limits of art against a culture at war with its neighbors and itself. They do not erase the lives saved in the interim by a decade of quiescent coasts. It is possible for a policy to succeed in its aim and fail in its beneficiary. Eddard's calculus, sparing Balan and keeping Theon, postponed war when the realm most needed the postponement. Without that quiet decade, the later coalition wars would have had to contend with Ironborn raiding at precisely the moment they were contending with Lannister gold and Riverland's fire. His tenure as Hand of the King distills the sharpest edge of his method. Where most men, elevated suddenly into the crowded heat of court, mistake intrigue for governance, he treated information as a weapon to be sheathed or drawn according to rules that did not change with the room. He traced the chain of deaths and debts that F.O. Lode John Aaron's last inquiries, and followed the thread of inheritance through recorded lineages and the candid bodies of children who looked like their fathers. The genealogies were not neutral. In his hands they became indictments. Yet even when he held a proof that could have toppled a dynasty in an afternoon, he chose a path that kept the justice and the peace in the same harness. He moved to proclaim the true heir in a manner that would not advertise the capital as a stage for massacres. He issued instructions that were lawful and legible, preserving the possibility that, even in defeat, his opponents could retreat into exile rather than total destruction. A mercy designed not for their sake but for the realm's. Men who fear annihilation will burn a capital to black glass to save themselves. Men who are offered a road out sometimes take it. The betrayal that followed cost him his head. It did not annul the strategic wisdom of his impulse. Even as the city shuddered under the usurpation of boys and their elders, an alternative script remained in the record. There had been a way to change rulers without butchery. The idea survived the man. In resigning as Hand rather than participate in a policy that would have sent cutthroats across the sea to stab a pregnant exile, he did more than keep his conscience intact. He preserved an asset he did not fully understand, yet understood not to squander, the possibility that the far shores would one day yield an ally rather than a vendetta. One can be coy about outcomes. We need not pretend he foresaw dragons or dead things marching out of the snow. We can say simply that killing children abroad, like killing them at home, corrodes the authority of the state and multiplies enemies. His refusal foreclosed one line of escalation and kept the ledger from acquiring a stain that would later make alliance impossible. When the East did at last produce forces decisive in the war against Winter, there was no Stark-signed writ that had sent murder to their beds. This absence mattered in negotiation and morale both. His local governance built people, not monuments. He trained heirs who would later hold lines that could not afford to break. The first scene of that training, an execution in frost performed by law before heirs, has been misread as paternal severity. It is curriculum design. He taught that the chain of command ends in a neck and a blade, and that the man who signaled a judgment must be prepared to shoulder its weight. The lesson kept sons from becoming the sort of lords who believe consequences can be outsourced. Years later, as the North fractured and reassembled around younger Starks, that pedagogy recurred in the way they signed orders and took risks. It also appears in negative space, in the panic of houses led by men accustomed to delegating danger and duty. His daughters went south with the manners of civility engraved deeply enough that they could wear them as disguises. His sons rode north with an ethic severe enough to recruit the free folk into a common cause without insulting them into rebellion. The person is not the policy, but the person can be the policy's memory. The subtlety of his alliances becomes visible when we count the houses that did not rebel until their profit seemed certain, and how many of them nevertheless answered a stark call when the summons was framed not as a quarrel among families but as a defense of people. Eddard had kept his levy asks fair over years, had accepted apologies from lesser lords who arrived late without turning lateness into exile, had resisted petty expropriations that make enemies in peacetime with no compensating advantage. When his children later sought swords, they found more than ancient honor. They found gratitude, which, in its most practical form, is the absence of old bills. A realm shaken by pretenders, tyrants, and saviors separated more readily into coalitions whose pattern reflected not ideology but interest. The North's coalition cohered around a memory of mild taxes and kept promises. That is Eddard's work, still paying dividends when the paymaster lay in the ground. The habit of not overreaching, of leaving something on the table for tomorrow, shaped his use of violence as much as his use of law. He did not raise pike when he could have, accepting the lesser vengeance to win the larger peace. He did not tear down southern houses entirely when given pretexts, even those that had insulted him. He did not remove dangerous courtiers by informal justice, preferring processes that submitted his enemies to procedures they claimed to respect. This created resentment among men who preferred the language of force to the grammar of law. It also constrained those men when they sought to avenge themselves. A lord undone by writs in the day cannot justify poison in the night to the same audience that would have cheered if he had been shoved from a battlement. In other words, Eddard weaponized reputational equilibrium. He was not naive about enemies. He chose to limit the arsenals they could publicly use. By making them expend credit to strike him, he ensured their victories would cost them allies. The immediate price was blood. The long-term return was isolation of those who triumphed over him. One sees this clearly in the sequence that followed his arrest. The Lannister faction's triumph should have quelled opposition. Instead, it birthed precisely the wars that emptied the treasury and shattered the riverlands. They had won the capital. They had lost the pretense of order. Eddard's letters and publicly witnessed acts framed the coup not as a necessary correction but as a theft. The northern levies that rose did so not as raiders but as sheriffs, in their own minds. The river lords who burned Lannister foraging parties believed they were restoring an equilibrium Eddard had kept. In a cruel accounting, his death made the wars worse. In a broader ledger, it made those wars winnable on terms that did not annihilate the North or permanently enthrone gold on the Iron Throne. He forced the usurpers to reveal themselves as such. He refused to grant them the legal fig leaf they craved. Even his failures, if one insists on calling them that without acknowledging their purchase, contributed to the calibration of later leaders. He misread the City Watch, measuring them by the reliability expected of northern household guards rather than the mercenary arithmetic of a capital police. The lesson was learned by his heirs, who in their turns bribed when bribery was a virtue and purged when purging became necessity. It is common to assign virtue to the dead and skill to the living. In this case, the living inherited skill because the dead had measured virtue against cost and paid it when he must. The ledger of sacrifice is not a romance. It is an instruction manual annotated in blood. When the time came for those he raised to choose between clean failure and dirty success, they remembered the father who chose a clean failure only at the moment when dirty success would have broken the state's legitimacy beyond repair. The foundational maxim that governed his conduct, "Winter is not a metaphor," underwrote decisions others found fussy. It was both a seasonal prophecy and a political practice. He treated spare coin as winter wheat, to be stored rather than paraded. He treated diplomacy as the art of conserving warmth in a drafty hall. He maintained garrisons at lonely towers because signal fires are cheaper to keep than armies to assemble. He made certain that men who manned the wall could count on timely consignments from Winterfell, even when the Watch's reputation became a jest of brothels. Those consignments kept the organization alive long enough to be worth saving when the event came that made it necessary. Half the realm, in later months, would emulate his winter policy overnight with less success. He had been practicing it all his life. There is, finally, the paradox of secrecy and revelation. By burying the truth of a child's parentage beneath the ordinary scandal of bastardy, he made it possible for the North to follow a man and only later an idea. This sequence mattered. A commander chosen for competence can then be embraced for claim. A claimant adopted first for name will be measured thereafter against a perfection no commander can meet. Eddard's decision forced hearts to make the discipline of trust before the intoxication of pageantry. The later coalition that stood against darkness held together because it could stand a hard leader. It would have shattered under the weight of a soft prince. When banners at last learned the blood truth, they did not abandon the man. They understood better the stakes of the war and the breadth of the peace that might follow. The hinge is not blood, but its timing in the narrative of loyalty. Eddard authored that timing. If one asks which acts most directly saved lives, one finds the following. He preserved Storm's End from starvation, thereby preserving a Baratheon whose fleet and stubbornness locked down seas and coasts at points where, later, a Lannister-only regime would have drowned. He concealed a child whose later service welded together northern spears and free folk axes into a wall of bone and iron that held long enough for fire and dawn to have their chances. He kept Theon close, which shackled iron-born ambition to paternal love for a decade precisely when the crown could least afford a maritime revolt. He refused to sign a warrant that would have sent assassins abroad, thereby preserving an eastern power that would one day spend dragonfire and unsullied spears against death itself instead of upon vengeance for murdered kin. He held the moral vocabulary of governance in a capital determined to unlearn it, which ensured that those who supplanted him would bleed legitimacy as they bled gold. These are not momentary rescues on the field. Though he executed those as required, but structural salvations, decisions that cinched tight knots in a fraying net so that whole regions did not fall through. In the middle distance of history, the shape of a life like his becomes clearest not in episodes but in continuities. The North he left functioned as a reservoir of collective action. Its roads did not rot in peacetime. Its harvests did not vanish into debt. Its lords did not spend their loyalty cheaply. That reservoir was what later leaders, some of his blood, some allied by adoption and ordeal, drew upon when they asked men to march not for plunder or pride but for survival. Without that reservoir, the aesthetic of unity would have remained a tapestry on a great hall wall. With it, oaths turned into logistics, logistics into plans, plans into battles that could be fought on chosen ground at chosen hours with chosen allies. The kingdom did not fracture along every line that greed and grief offered. Could have. The difference is not luck. It is policy composed in long winters and tested in short summers. Those looking for flamboyance will find little. The palette is gray, the medium is routine. Yet a ledger that balances, a storehouse that feeds, a letter that names a lawful heir instead of a favorite, a march made in mud to a starved fortress, a refusal to buy an easy safety with a murdered girl far away. These are choices of a quality that grows in significance as the scale of events expands. In an age of men eager to be necessary, he practiced being reliable. Reliable men do not produce good stories. They produce good outcomes. One can prefer the former. The latter tends to survive the winter. The peculiar power of his memory is that it does not need burnished statues to exert pressure on the living. It operates as the standard by which the young measure their own compromises, as the inconvenient example invoked by counselors who ask their captains to choose the slower right over the swifter wrong. When later commanders drafted their best politica, plays, battle by battle, as one chronicler styled it, their technique depends upon a grammar he enforced, that ends cannot safely be separated from means, that a decision's merit is measured not only by its immediate effect but by what it teaches allies and enemies to expect, that a reputation for steadiness is a strategic resource more precious than gold. This is not moralism smuggled into strategy. It is strategy that recognizes morale as a supply line and legitimacy as fortification. The long view, then, sees Eddard Stark not as a tragic hero decapitated by a city that mistook its entertainments for governance, but as the architect of conditions under which tragedies did not aggregate into a terminal decline. His acts saved particular lives and, more importantly, degrees of freedom, rooms in which future leaders could move that would otherwise have been bricked up. He padded the realm against its worst tendencies. He refused to carve his family's name into public accounts with tyranny and blood feuds. He adjusted alliances with a mechanic's patience, tightened bolts others had loosened out of vanity, replaced gears others had ground to a halt with posturing. He is thus, paradoxically, the author of victories he did not live to see, because victory is often the cumulative result of not losing the little battles that history forgets to record. It is, finally, fitting that the masterstroke most worthy of the name was an act that cost him reputation in the moment and paid the realm in the long term. He claimed as his own a child whose blood might have undid the peace he had bled to build, then raised that child within a moral economy severe enough to breed duty without breeding fear. That single decision simultaneously disarmed the immediate threat of a dynastic civil war and nurtured, without fanfare, the leader who would later coordinate the only coalition capacious enough and disciplined enough to fight winter with any hope of endurance. If the realm endured, it is because, when confronted with a choice between a clean story and a stable future, he chose the future and lived the story that made it possible. The legend of the North is not the snow nor the wolves nor the old gods whispering in leaves. It is the administrative miracle of a lord who believed that paperwork and patience could hold a continent together long enough for better moments to arrive. The miracle, in the end, worked. We can draw the record to a close without gilding it. A minimalist reads his life as a set of ordinary acts performed in extraordinary fidelity. A strategist reads it as a chain of local optimizations that, because they were consistent and moral, aggregated into global advantage. A realm that survived ice and fire alike required, along its perimeters and in its center, an ethic that could be trusted to behave the same on market day and coronation day. Eddard Stark embodied that ethic. The realm his children and their allies inherited bore the imprint of his method as surely as Winterfell bears the print of hot springs under stone. When we speak of masterstrokes, we usually imagine sudden cuts, the flourish of a blade at the right angle. His genius was closer to the craftsman's. Sharp tools applied steadily at the same angle for years. The cut is still visible in the timeline. It is the straight line that spared the realm from being broken into pieces it could never have reassembled. There remains a ledger of lesser choices whose aggregate weight equals the famous ones. They are the fibers in the rope that later bore the strain. He kept Moat Cailin manned through unglamorous seasons when no threat pressed the causeway, treating the fortress not as a ruin draped in songs but as a functioning choke point. The watch schedules he imposed allowed for weather delays and illness. No shift change coincided with the high mists that allied the boundaries between bog and path. Guards were rotated before fatigue could erase judgment, and the repair crews who hauled timbers to shore up the 3 basalt towers were escorted not by heavy cavalry that bogs but by small, sure-footed teams used to hauling staves through the fens. This sounded to bored ears like an old lord fussing about masonry. In practice, it denied the South a clear path into the North without negotiation. When Robb Stark later marched, he crossed south through a bottleneck he could lock behind him, forcing enemies to funnel into a narrow geometry that punished rash pursuit. The present war was enabled by a past maintenance schedule. His approach to hospitality functioned as a state instrument as well. Winterfell's open tables, funded by surplus put by in years of fat harvests, were not simply kindness. They were a communications network. Men who ate standing at trestles under the banners learned the news of the holdfasts where they'd be laying seed in spring. Travelers brought word of broken bridges and treacherous ford stones. Captains moving levy lists compared notes with old men who remembered which hamlets could be trusted to deliver butter in hard weeks. Over steaming bowls the North edited itself, reconciling differences before they became feuds, correcting bad information before it bred panic. The Lord's presence at these meals, tempered, steady, listening more than speaking, kept complaints from becoming petitions and petitions from metastasizing into demands. It is easy to miss the connection between soup ladled in a hall and levies marching on time. It is easier still to appreciate it when one consults the years that lacked those meals and finds more brawls, more absconding tenants, more surprise refusals to ride. He understood that morale and governance start at tables. When he accepted the direwolf pups, an indulgence to children in the eyes of many, he made a marginal bet that later compounded. Tradition counseled caution with creatures of the wild, especially those stamped with the North's own totem. He could have forbid, and the keeping and barked the order into compliance. Instead, he recognized that the wolves, as bonds between house and children, would breed a discipline of care. The choice transmitted a lesson. A dangerous power watched with attention can be an asset. Unacknowledged and abandoned, it becomes a threat. The consequences neither he nor any maester could have guessed. The capacity of those bonds to save, scout, and warn in ways beyond natural ken are not necessary to justify the policy. It was a household act that reinforced an administrative habit. Integrate what cannot be denied into the structure of responsibility. That habit, when later applied to free folk, bastards, and bannermen with awkward histories, made coalitions possible where other lords saw only risks to exclude. The decision to return the swords and bones of foes with ceremony and speed was another practice many contemporaries mocked as scrupulous. After the tower in the Dornish mountains fell quiet, he carried south not only sorrow but etiquette. He bore the remains of Arthur Dane to Starfall and returned Dawn to its custodians, refusing to hold a dead man's legend hostage to triumph. That observance did not reconcile Dorne to the new order. Blood cannot be so cheaply redeemed, but it kept grief from calcifying into a cause. When the new regime struggled to secure tacit acceptance along the southern marches, the memory in Dorne of stark courtesies gave cautious men just enough reason to wait and watch rather than lash out. Much later, when secret ships crossed to and fro and southern daggers could have struck at northern throats for ancestral insult, the knife hand wavered. An enemy treated as a worthy foe is slower to become a permanent enemy of the state. He managed grievance like a scarce commodity to be rationed rather than a resource for demagogues to mine. He pursued the Mormont matter with the same legal spine. A lord of Bear Island bartered men into bondage in a foreign market. The kind of infraction easily indulged by a crown that rarely bothered itself with remote islands. Eddard pressed the warrant. The offender fled and became, in exile, an asset to forces he could not imagine. The record shows no sign that Winterfell intended such a second-order effect. The immediate goal was clarity that northern law bound northern lords. Yet in tracing the strands of the war against Winter and Fire's later alliance, it is difficult not to mark that a counselor of worth to a dragon queen existed because the North, through its lord, had insisted on a standard that sent him across the sea. Unintended consequences cut both ways. His habit of acting by rules made the unanticipated likelier to be constructive than corrosive. As Hand, his insistence on due process in the case of Gregor Clegane was overtly political as well as juridical. When reports of burned holdfasts in the Riverlands reached the capital, he did not answer with the reciprocal aristocratic vengeance that had been the default mechanism of correction. He sent a royal writ and a named Lord Beric Dondarrion with a narrow mandate: bring the offender to justice. Cynics called it theater. Realists saw the calculation. By keeping the mission within law's frame and under seal, he placed the onus for escalation on those who would defy that law. From that seed grew a band that would outlast banners, protecting small folk in a theater of war where small folk were usually counted in charred beams rather than in plans. The brotherhood without banners would later become a thorn in the side of every army careless with the people's lives, a living argument that the compact between lord and peasant did not dissolve in wartime. His order created conditions for such a thing to be legitimate. Even decay, its later mutations and its leaders' transformations, does not negate the core. He set in motion a force that taught the Riverlands a stubborn vocabulary of justice independent of courtly lords. His exposure of the illegitimacy at the heart of the crown confronted a basic decision that is the hinge on which states either reform or collapse: whether to solve a constitutional crisis by constitutional means. He had the knives necessary for a palace solution. He could have arranged for a prince to die in the night and called it illness, as had been done before. He proceeded instead by collecting evidence, presenting it through proper channels, seeking to secure the watch loyal to law rather than to purse or favor. The miscalculation lies not in the choice of method but in the choice of instrument. He extended to the city watch a trust they did not deserve unbought. A northern lord who pays his men and commands their rooted loyalty thought to transfer that model to a capital police accustomed to payments in coin and permission. This cost him the city and his life. It won him, in the longer horizon of state memory, the dignity of a precedent. When later reforms were attempted, Men could point to the parchment and the practice he had laid down and say that it had been tried and thus could be tried again. He refused a pair of murderous expeditions that would have satisfied the impatient and trapped the realm in a cycle of vendettas. He would not bless Tywin Lannister's exterminatory campaigns in the Riverlands, and he would not authorize the assassination of a girl and her unborn child across the sea. Both refusals cost him standing among men who see hardness as the only relatable virtue. Both preserved options later enlisted against enemies none of them had weighed with any seriousness. It is too simple to say that he spared one exile to later become a liberator for his own armies. The facts are a cloud of contingencies. It is exact to say that he declined to make bargaining impossible. He kept the future ajar. The rescue at Storm's End, which often is treated as a mere courtesy to a Baratheon, deserves extended analysis as an inflection point he uniquely perceived. Stannis Baratheon's hunger behind thick walls was more than an individual suffering. It was the slow gnawing of legitimacy. Had the siege completed itself with surrender, the message to every lord would have been that the new order rested at the mercy of the houses of the Reach and Lannisport. Robert's crown would have been a loan, not an inheritance. Eddard's march reframed the balance of creditors. The man rescued, inflexible to a fault, repaid debt in the only coin he was willing to recognize: service measured by statute. The fleets and the iron determination that later protected the narrow sea were assets purchased by food wagons and banner shadows appearing on a horizon of starving men. That is a clear line. Palisades are fed as much by memory as by grain. More domestic choices aligned with these grand currents. He maintained the gift as the Watch's patrimony against vassal encroachment, refusing the temptation, nearly universal among comfortable houses, to let borders creep in the guise of stewarding. Local squires groused at lost grazing rights. Village heads wrote angry complaints about wolves and wasted pasture. He did not permit the creep. Lands meant as endowment for a brotherhood whose tasks looked increasingly like tradition were kept intact, which meant that when the Watch required breath to recover and recruit in crisis, they had not been starved of their legal and material base. Many a desperate measure fails not because men lack courage, but because men lack options grounded in law. He preserved the option even when the organization it sustained appeared obsolete. His handling of the Iron Islands, beyond Theon's custody, relied on knowing when to stop tightening the screws. He did not crush the Greyjoy's dignity utterly. The inclination to grind defeated men into the earth is powerful in victors who have buried their own dead. His restraint kept alive a thin cord by which the islands could feel themselves attached to the realm even in humiliation. He insisted on hostages, on disarmament, on blows enough to deter. He declined measures meant to erase. Theon's years in Winterfell were both a leash and a chance at acculturation. They failed in that second aim, and at a crucial hour the leash snapped. Yet catalogue the years between rebellion and betrayal. The coasts of the north and the Riverlands were not systematically harried from pike. The fisheries recovered from wartime depletion. Ships bearing grain from White Harbor and timber from the Wolfswood reached buyers instead of splintering under raiders' hooks. That period of maritime relative peace allowed families to rebuild stocks and holdfasts to repair roofs, which is precisely the sort of boring prosperity a careful kingdom needs to accumulate invisibly if it is to pay for a winter of real war. A policy can be judged by its failures. It must also be judged by the ordinary goods it yields for as long as it holds. His hostage plan yielded a decade of such goods. Of his pedagogy, the first execution and its ritual posture are often cited because of their starkness. Less often remembered is the way he curated access to judgment. Petitioners in his hall were not treated as entertainment for a lord's mood. The schedule for hearings was kept regular enough that travel did not require speculative camping for weeks under the eaves. He insisted on written statements when men could produce them, on repetition of facts, on witnesses that could be checked. This staved off the creep of whim into law that ruins a province faster than taxation ever will. It also trained generations of house stewards and headmen in habits of record-keeping that made later military requisitions possible without collapsing local economies. If a holdfast can produce 3 carts rather than 5, because the steward keeps a ledger, an army reaches the next town without burning it. Such linkages are rarely celebrated because they are too sane to make a ballad. They are, however, the difference between campaigns that strip the earth and campaigns that pass through it once and are invited back again should the need arise. The oft-cited lesson that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword is too frequently reduced to a morality tale. It is a logistics principle. He trained his household to internalize the costs of their decisions. When officers who have watched a lord misjudge and then labor by his side to correct the judgment tell others to prepare for battle in bad weather, the others listen. There is a kink introduced by this practice into the chain of command. An extra second of thought before an order, not out of fear, but out of practice. In times of peace, such deliberation looks slow. In times of war, it divides charlatans from commanders. The young men and women who left Winterfell to hold walls and raise banners did so with an instinctive reticence about flamboyance that saved lives. When they did resort to cunning or speed, it was not the performative kind that collapses on contact with enemy steel, but the practice sort that keeps a reserve, watches the flanks, and knows where the supply wagon should be at dusk. The investigation into bastardy that became the legal core of the succession crisis shows him not only as a man of conscience but as an archivist. He read books of lineages often treated as decorative. He visited the armorer's school and looked at a boy's face after looking at the faces of men likely to have bred him. A chain of observation more careful than the elite typically bother with. He did not share his notes with too many allies, not because he hoarded knowledge, but because he understood that every transmission is a risk. The pace of his inquiry is important. He did not race into the king's chambers with a whisper and a dagger. He moved slowly enough that, had assassination not been attempted on his friend the king, the matter could have been brought to council with his hands still upon the lever. The choice to inform the queen before info. Remaining the city was not naivete alone. It presented an opportunity for those who had erred to choose exile, thus saving the realm a public humiliation that would have damaged its ability to project power outward. That calculation trusted too much in the capacity of guilty power to choose restraint. But its form was correct. Men will accept the justice of a system that offers them exit ramps. Those who refuse them can be named rebels with fewer doubters. At court, he misjudged Peter Baelish's appetite for chaos, thinking it the usual ambition to climb rather than the fetish for flux itself. This error belongs in any serious accounting, not to belittle him but to delineate limits on the application of northern norms to southern men. His strength was precisely that he did not make policy under the assumption that men were irredeemable. He relied on coordinates that work north of the neck. Reputation restrains perfidy. Oaths have a gravitational force. Communities can organize to isolate egregious betrayers. In the capital, anonymity and appetite functioned as solvents on those restraints. He paid for that mismatch. The lesson that his heirs drew, pay men what they are, not what one wishes them to be, tempered the grace of his method with a lodged splinter of suspicion that later allowed them to trade when circumstances required and purge when trade had run its course. He kept open channels to the Vale even when the airy turned inward and strange. John Arryn's widow's letter seeded suspicion with his lady wife. Eddard did not allow that to become a feud with a region that had, in earlier days, formed him. This non-reaction was a calculation. The Vale's resources, locked behind their mountains, were unlikely to be coaxed out with anger, but might be available to his children should a later crisis draw down their neutrality. So it proved, when a cavalry that still remembered a Stark fosterling, that had never been publicly insulted by Winterfell, descended to a northern field at a decisive hour. Again, he did not contest Littlefinger for control of the Vale because that was never within his repertoire. He preserved the memory of his connection in a way that allowed later claimants allied to his family to insist on it. The quiet provisioning of Gendry in the capital, a boy apprenticed to a master smith and kept purposely obscure, belongs with these as a minor choice whose later contribution is outsized. Rumor said and documents indicated that the boy likely bore the blood of a king. Eddard saw in him neither asset to be flaunted nor threat to be disposed of, but a child to be placed somewhere he could grow safe. He bought that safety with coin of his own, not the crown's, and instructed that the boy be kept off certain lists. Years forward, in one of those exquisite hinges the gods favor, the same boy's arms and endurance would matter in battles that did not ask after pedigree. A realm's capacity to convert byblows into comrades depends on whether its leaders make place for them. He made place. His stewardship of relations with White Harbor exemplified his strategic patience with semi-autonomous powers. House Manderley's unique position, a southern-leaning mercantile house grafted onto the North's tree, always presented opportunity and risk. He never tried to force the Manderleys into the mold of a forest lord. He let them be what they were so long as their ships sailed under Stark-friendly flags. He protected their trade privileges overland even when river merchants complained. In return, he received a port that could provision northern campaigns and a house that would later leverage its wealth and cunning on behalf of his progeny. The alternative, an attempt to convert White Harbor into a caricature of wolfswood piety, would have created an enemy in fat times who could play the North against the South at will. Most commentaries treat his motto, "Winter is coming," as a dour philosophy. It was an economic theory. He set tax rates with the presupposition that lean years would arrive, wrote contracts with millers that allowed for temporary crown requisition at preset prices in famine, maintained barns whose contents were tracked with an almost obsessive care for turnover to prevent rot. In each of these mundane instruments, one recognizes the hand of someone who understood that the collective capacity to act declines fastest not under swords but under hunger. He made sure that, when campaign time came in autumn, there were still peasants willing to stay in fields to gather the grain rather than flee with the banners, because last time the army came it took seed corn and left nothing. By keeping the social machine lubricated, he ensured that war did not cannibalize its chassis. His return of the Dane's sword and the respect shown in Dorne echo into another decision: to suffer personal calumny about Ashera Dane rather than weaponize the truth about another's honor for a day's advantage. Gossip is the lifeblood of lordly coteries. A man may, by telling the truth at the wrong time, destroy a house to which the realm may later appeal for help. He held his tongue. A historian resists mythology, yet one can assign strategic value to the choice to keep certain silences. Later, when emissaries bearing the Stark name went south, they were not turned away at every door. There were houses in Dorne and the marches prepared to listen before they refused, because a Stark had once grieved without accusing. The legal instrument he drafted at the end, the paper naming him protector to guard the throne for Stannis, has been derided by those who think parchment is no match for steel. It is not a match. It is a compass. Armies move under banners, and banners must have pretenses. The pretenses he chose were not his own aggrandizement but regency in the name of the next lawful king. This mattered even in failure. Had he chosen to seize the throne outright in the name of emergency, those who later took up the cause of law would have been forced to argue on terms borrowed from usurpation. Because he kept the law unbroken on his end, those who broke it had to do so nakedly. The wars that followed were uglier for the bodies. They were cleaner for the documents. Clean documents let peace knit faster. He also practiced a strategic diplomacy of slowness. Where southern lords prefer events that compress into a day and determine a decade, he allowed certain problems to remain unsolved into a solvable shape. He did not compel Lady Catelyn's sisters to return to court. He let the Vale's quarrels ripen into a situation where later, under different leadership, the Vale's weight could be placed with maximum effect. He did not force prompt tribute from houses rebuilding after war, trusting that relief now would produce more reliable oath fulfillment later. This patience is indistinguishable from caution to eyes trained only to watch for coups and battles. Its yield appears when battles are fought with grain moving on schedule. At personal cost, he applied symmetry to his own family that others would have reserved for neighbors. He did not use Lady's death as a moment to spar with a queen. He took the life himself in the exact manner the law prescribed. He could have delegated. He did not. The effect on his relations with the court was damaging. The effect on the narrative his children carried into adulthood was priceless. It wrote into their marrow the prohibition against enjoying exemptions because of blood or title. Leaders who expect indulgence lose the reflex to husband it. When it fell to his heirs to ask the North to endure hunger, humiliation, and a campaign that seemed aimless until it suddenly was not, they were believed because their father had once taken on himself a misery he might have escaped. Consider the problem of the free folk, which the North had for generations misnamed the enemy. It is tempting to write the later alliance under his son as a break with past policy. It was not. Eddard's consistent backing of the Watch as a law-keeping institution, instead of letting it degenerate into a penal colony abandoned to its own mythology, kept open a channel through which communication with the people beyond the wall could flow when the time demanded. He did not glamorize the Watch. He funded it, inspected its officers, and corrected its abuses when they crossed into the north. The culture that grew around Castle Black under such distant tutelage, however decayed, retained a residue of discipline and ritual that could be recognized as kin to northern governance. That recognition later allowed trust to be extended to men and women who had never bent a knee to a southern crown. It turns out that customs explain themselves to each other more easily than creeds. He preserved the customs. There were strategic withdrawals as well. When a hunting accident ended a royal life and the court became an arena in which his presence now served as pretext for civil tiers of the realm, he prepared to evacuate his daughters rather than posture. He sent for ships, entrusted their movement not to men fettered by court alliances but to those whose loyalty ran through household, and planned to witness the succession from a position of distance that would have preserved the option to intervene with an army if law were broken. That option was pried from him by betrayal rather than sacrificed by vanity. The method remains instructive. When choice presents between seeing the crown change hands in the thick of lies and seeing it from a distance where the shape of truth is clearer, choose distance if distance can preserve strength. The Riverland's brief experiment with law under his handship, the summons to Tywin Lannister to answer for his banner's depredations, was likewise a statement to houses that the age of impunity might be ending. Tywin did not come, but other lords watched. They saw that, for the first time in years, the writ of the realm threatened to bind even the great. The expectation that followed did not die with him. It slept. When other hands later raised the song of reform, they were not singing a new tune but a remembered chorus. The realm's capacity to hear it without laughter owed to his time restoring the ear. In the north he kept the levees of resentment intact without letting them burst the banks of order. He allowed disputes between the Umbers and the Boltons to be mediated without public humiliation. When proud men are always corrected before a crowd, they begin to plan to replace the crowd. He made settlements in private with public consequences. This courtesy did not spare him the later betrayal of a house that had eaten from his table. It did diminish the number of houses willing to follow a traitor's banner. The Boltons marched with fewer friends than they might have. Their ferocity had no cushion of legitimacy because the man they betrayed had not made it easy to accuse him of vanity or abuse. One must not overcredit policy for courage. But policy clears the field so that courage can show. Along roads he laid a pattern of tithe and courtesy stations that doubled as watchposts. These outposts took in travelers, sold feed at fair rates, and functioned as places where the Lord's men and the small folk could exchange news. They also allowed ravens to stage in predictable fashion from tower to tower. When later alarms had to be sent in the middle of winter, when the sky eats sound and men doubt their senses, the existence of places already known as neutral and useful for messages prevented confusion from becoming violence. This appears trivial until one maps the early days of panics in other regions. A rumor that becomes a riot because there is no architecture built for clarification is a phenomenon a northern planner trained by him avoided. At court, he used recorded debts as levers against the master of coin's more dangerous games. He did not pretend that books could defeat schemes, but he put numbers on the council. Table that forced men to stare at their own appetites. He limited the size of the royal retinue's hunting trains, trimmed tourney expenses where he could, and insisted on payments to the city's bakers so that the capital would not starve even as the court played at magnificence. A starving capital is a powder keg for coups. By keeping the ovens lit, he bought days of order that allowed statecraft to be attempted. He failed in that room. He succeeded in reducing the collateral damage of his failure. During the initial stages of Robert's rebellion, he applied a theory of second fronts rarely articulated by lords not trained in books of war. He avoided pursuing fugitives into mountain scrums after the Trident when such pursuit would have sprayed northern blood pointlessly across rock corridors friendly to guerrillas. He moved instead to secure population centers, bread baskets, and bridges, depriving the enemy of the resources with which to contest later campaigns. The emotional economy of pursuit, avenging friends killed by royalists, yielded to the actual economy of grain and timber. He understood that Pyrrhic victories were an unaffordable luxury for provinces with winters that would demand more from survivors than any vengeful raid could repay. A longer chain binds his refusal to remove tyrannical small lords extrajudicially to the later durability of Northern coalition. He knew that to cultivate a habit of exception is to sow fear among the marginal. He therefore pursued processes, even when the processes were cumbersome, to remove abusers. This signaled to petty tyrants that their time would eventually run out. It signaled to the timid that their patience in the law would be rewarded. The timid, who outnumber the brave and who pay the taxes, are the sovereign's real constituency. When the call to rally came later from his blood, that constituency had not been alienated into torpor by years of capricious governance. If the realm's saviors in the last wars display a mode of coalition politics that seems novel, it is because they used new actors in old patterns. Free folk fought beside kneelers. A dragon flew above a northern spearhead. A smith's hammer beat a cadence for a highborn line to follow. The novelty is superficial. The pattern, the careful deployment of legitimacy as a supply line, the command of logistics as moral argument, the moderation of vengeance into law was Eddard's. He did not create the circumstances that later leaders faced. He created the habits by which those circumstances could be met without the state dissolving into factional ash. It is tempting, mapping this life, to install a theory of inevitability and claim that, because he existed, certain later alignments had to form. That would be an error. The world is not mechanistic, and his death is the best evidence that fortune often refuses even modest requests. The more appropriate claim is humbler and stronger. He raised the floor. By treaties kept, barns stocked, courtesies extended, and lines of law held in drought and deluge alike, he raised the minimum level of competence and decency that the North, and through it the realm, would accept from those who led them. When catastrophe came, that floor did not collapse into pit but held as staging ground. What followed could be improvisation because the basics did not first require reconstruction. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the long twilight when fear of winter crept from children's tales into commanders' plans. Soldiers accustomed to being paid on time, farmers used to seeing grain set aside for the common good, households trained to accept rationing without a spasm of riot. These are the conditions in which a general can order a retreat without triggering stampede, in which an evacuating column can pass through villages that do not attempt to strip it for parts. His work is the silence behind the successes. The absence of mutiny, the absence of famine in a siege's first months, the absence of that corrosion of faith without which alliances splinter at the first reverse. This chronicle cannot pretend that none of his acts spawned tragedy. The custody of Theon became a brand seared into one boy's soul and produced betrayals whose pain cannot be mooted by ledgers. The refusal to play by the capital's rules cost him his life and plunged his family into trials none deserve. Yet even here, a harder accounting reveals benefits. The shame of one hostage did stay the hands of raiders long enough to save other boys and girls. The death of one man turned him into a measure by which men gauged their own compromises. Tragedy is the language of consequence. Policy is its grammar. He spoke both in a way that allowed the story to go on. The shaped emptiness he left in the capital, the absence of a countervailing force to the faction that preferred games to governance, accelerated the very crisis that in the end forced houses to choose the realm over their petty agendas. Had he survived, it is possible the realm would have drifted longer in the opiate of spectacle. Instead, the ugliness surfaced quickly. Wars came in a flood, the treasury bled, the small folk screamed, and the pretense that rule could be divorced from responsibility shattered. The resulting cauldron burned away much that was corrupt. His life and his loss together comprised the alchemy by which the realm remembered itself. When the final reckonings are made, and lists are drawn of acts that saved the realm, the temptation is to elevate the moments when swords flashed and castles fell. This narrative has tried to show that the acts that mattered most often took the form of a refusal, a repair, a delay, a delivery of bread, a signature that aligned a name with a standard instead of with a whim. Eddard Stark executed a narrow band of tools with such consistency that the tools became the realm's hands even when he was gone. In years of rust and fever, when new men learned to hold a line or to convene a co, Unsil that did not immediately turn into an auction, they were using his instruments. It is the nature of such work that it tends to be inherited rather than celebrated. The last and perhaps most contentious claim belongs to the territory between choice and chance. He protected a child whose existence could have detonated the new order. He did not know what that child would become, only that he must not become the spark of a post-war conflagration. Having made that choice, he then insulated the boy's upbringing from the corruptions that often accompany secrets. He did not make him a prince in the shadows, did not curry favor for him among houses with hints of future reward, did not shape him as a tool for acclaim. He raised a son, not a claimant. The man who emerged from that anonymity was therefore a leader who could stand on merit among men who cared nothing for Targaryen or Baratheon, who bled because a captain told them the truth and bled beside them. The later revelation of blood did not spoil that credit. It extended it across houses still ensnared in dynastic mania. A less disciplined guardian would have produced in that child a different sort of man, one who knew his blood and believed himself owed. The realm cannot be saved by men who are owed, can be saved by men who owe. Eddard Stark, who owed everyone in the quiet way of a man who keeps accounts, made such a man. Everything in this record points to a single ethic. Power must be managed as though winter were coming even in summer. He seldom mistook friendship for policy, spectacle for victory, appetite for law. He saved up, not coin alone but legitimacy, and spent it grudgingly on things that lasted. Others chased a kind of immortality that statues promise. He left instead an immortality of procedures and expectations, a furniture of the mind that makes future courage possible and future folly harder to sustain. When the banners finally furled and the dead burned and the books were written, it turned out that the realm had not been saved by a single stroke but by a pattern of strokes, evenly spaced, reliably delivered, sharpening the blade each time so that it would still cut after long use. That pattern bears his name, whether spoken or not, whether celebrated or merely lived. If the War of the Five Kings taught cartographers to redraw the political map with ash rather than with ink, the preface to that lesson lies in the way Eddard Stark taught his own people to expect continuity across seasons. He did not govern Winterfell as an isolated monument but as a junction. In the archives of the keep, charcoal numbers pressed into parchment beside Maester Luwin's tidy glosses. One sees a permanent dialogue between stone and road, tower and field. The ledgers tally not only rents and yields but the periodic dispatch of masons, farriers and grain measurers to outlying holds, each entry annotated with a small practical purpose. Relay ravens, inspect culverts before thaw, replenish lamp oil where beacons are often starved by wind. To outsiders, this is the literature of tedium. To soldiers who must march when ordered, to small folk who must plant when told, it is the difference between a levy whose carts arrive with axles sound and one that falls to kindling along the first day's ruts. When Winterfell called, it did so without the sour aftertaste of neglect. That one habit of announcing a summons after years of giving reasons for the summons to be believed shaped the North's later coherence more deeply than any oath formed beneath a heart tree in an hour's ceremony. It was a coherence deliberately inoculated against personality cults. Eddard did not organize his house around himself but around offices that functioned with or without his presence. He trusted Roderick Castle to keep the garrison disciplined and Harrion and Jory to extend the household's muscle without making enemies of neighbors, and he trained in his children the expectation that command cycles through capable hands rather than congealing around a single will. When a lord treats his bannermen as extensions of his ego, they learn sulking as a tactic. When he treats them as parts in a complex machine, they learn reliability as a virtue. Thus, when he rode south to take the king's hand, the machine did not shudder. The courtyards filled with the sounds of practice rather than panic. The granaries kept their ratios. The roads continued to be walked by marshals whose presence signaled maintenance, not surveillance. Robb's youth did not become a pretext for faction because the house's routines did not require interpretation. Habit replaces charisma in a well-ordered province. This replacement paid a compound dividend when the call to war was sounded not as a Stark raid but as a northern campaign that asked for patience as well as fury. The banners that gathered at Moat Cailin were not merely swords. They were teams of carters, wains packed to a schedule, geldings rotated before they could founder in the bog. The causeway that slices the neck is the physical mystery of the continent. A slender road through drowning lands that, if held, can turn an entire kingdom into a peninsula. Eddard had preserved that geometry long before his son exploited it. His insistence on keeping the three towers at Moat Cailin minimally habitable, his coordination with crannogmen who understood water as terrain rather than hazard, his system for dispersing caches of fodder in elevated sheds along the treeline, each of these small matters became strategic in a week. When the North marched south, it did not leave a door ajar behind it. When it returned, it found the door still on its hinges. No foe surged up through the marsh to raid as they wished. They had to ask, and the North's answer was structural. No. The oft-repeated calumny that he was a man unsuited to courts because he valued rules more than outcomes ignores the way he orchestrated outcomes by training his realm's appetite for RUL. The northern lords, accustomed by him to respect predictable levies and impartial hearing, came to believe that law protects their dignity at least as much as their coin. Such belief is an infrastructure more valuable than roads. It allowed a young commander later to snub a capricious ally in a moment of principle and not lose his coalition entirely. It allowed a bastard to summon houses to a cause that was not dynastic but existential and be heard without the reflexive sneer that would have met him in more mannered regions. The North under Eddard was weaned from the worst parts of aristocratic vanity without being tutored into the helplessness of peasants who fear every knock at the door. Freedom diagnosed as duty is the form of liberty that fights well. He prescribed it under the guise of harvest management. It is fashionable for Southern commentators to pretend that his insistence on feeding the Night's Watch was nostalgia, the indulgence of a man trapped by stories. The ledger contradicts that sentiment. His consignments north were calculated to a principle, not to a song. A chain of small holds in the gift were kept stocked with grains and salt caught ahead of the worst weeks. The ravens that carried schedules for handovers flew on predetermined days so that the watch's quartermasters could plan without begging. A commander whose fallback position is stocked, whose scouts know they can return to hearths with bread and a bed even if the campaign goes poorly, can order daring. A commander whose rear is chaos demands heroism because he has little else to offer. Eddard's policy, sustained over years, kept alive the backstop that later allowed daring at the wall. It also kept alive the thought, small, stubborn, derided until the hour it was needed, that the border between story and threat shifts with the season and that the wise keep their powder dry. He applied a similar suspicion to rumor when it touched on the great houses. Where others sought advantage in scandal, he sought stability in discretion. The return of dawn to Starfall, conducted with the proper ceremonies, signaled a doctrine that he enforced consistently. Valor must be honored even in enemies, and an honorable enemy is not the same thing as a sworn friend but may someday be preferred to many supposed friends. Dorne, a principality with a long memory for insult, saw in his courtesy an argument against permanent vendetta. It is true that later confusions and crimes would reignite old grievances. It is also true that when a Stark emissary knocked at Starfall years later asking safe passage or assistance, he did not encounter a door barred by offense at some petty theft of a sword. Diplomacy often presents itself as words exchanged by peers. In difficult provinces, it is more often the slow accumulation of reasons not to hate. His friendship with Jon Arryn, too, housed a method mistaken by some as mere sentiment. He did not flatter his foster father's region with insincere attention. He memorized its decisional culture. The Vale's lords respond not to flares of passion but to demonstrations of reliability, and he kept up a correspondence in which requests and favors were exchanged only as fast as delivery could be guaranteed. Thus, when the Eyrie later withdrew into the isolation of a wintering mind, the Vale did not become an automatic enemy of the North. It became a patient audience for those in the next generation who could present themselves as heirs to Eddard's style rather than as penitents demanding restitution for small slights. A bridge not burned is a future campaign shortened by weeks. He left many such bridges. What looks to zealots like softness acquired a hard edge when placed against Lannister appetite. As Hand, confronted by reports of torching in the Riverlands, he sent justice under seal rather than reprisal under banner. The difference mattered in three ways. First, it forced Tywin's war to begin as a rebellion against lawful process instead of as an extension of normal noble feuding. Houses on the fence could countenance indemnity for a lord punished lawfully in a way they could not bless resistance to a warrant. Second, it created in the riverlands a sanctified nucleus, the men sworn to Berwick's charge, that served as moral provender when castles fell and serfs fled. Third, it demonstrated to the crown's wavering servants that obedience to office rather than to faction was a viable route to honor. When that demonstration was followed by the spectacle of the watch selling itself to the highest bidder, the revulsion was measurable, and it flowed along channels his brief handship had dug, to the Brotherhood's banner, to river lords who could say with conviction that their cause was not merely vengeance but law. He lost the city. He gained for the realm a story about itself that did not require the Lannister ledger for validation. His refusal to murder the exile and her babe across the sea has been misread as squeamishness. It was an application of his general policy against creating problems larger than the ones he meant to solve. A queen killed in her exile produces martyrs. A girl permitted to live produces a distraction. Southern courtiers prefer to resolve threats at their most glamorous point, in the assassination, the shock, rather than at their most tedious, in the marginalization of an unhappy claimant. He took the tedium. Later, when the East produced not a claimant but an army with a grievance against the same enemies who had poisoned the realm, his restraint proved an asset. The possibility that the East might be an ally required that the North not have placed a bloody stone in that bowl of the scale. Alliances are not made by piety alone. They are made by the absence of impossible insults. He understood that the price of that refusal would be paid in the coin of court esteem. He paid it. This readiness to absorb personal loss to preserve institutional options recurs throughout his decisions. It pairs in the custody of Theon Greyjoy, which he accepted knowing that the hostage's gratitude would be, at best, contingent and, at worst, a seed of trouble. He took the boy anyway because the logic of statecraft demanded it. A father with his son in a foreign hall calculates differently than a father unbound by anything save the price of a new ship. The fact that the boy's own character and fate took a darker path does not dissolve the decade of quiet coasts the North purchased with that lodging. The North's fishing fleets recovered, its shipwrights repaired salt-bitten ribs and keels, its coastal villages banked stores rather than ashes. When a later winter drafted those same resources for war against something older than ironborn vanity, they were available because they had not been squandered on an earlier round of raiding. His bargain held long enough to bankroll future survival. The lineage inquiry that ended at the iron point of a child's hair color, a humble detail elevated into a legal spear, was governance by footnote. He read books neglected by men intoxicated with immediate advantage and was killed because he assumed that a capital that keeps archives also respects them. On this he was wrong in timing and right in method. The wrong timing we can specify. He counted on the city watch as though it were a northern household guard and so failed to lubricate obedience with coin. The right method we can measure in durability. Once he wrote the principle that the crown is not inherited by whim but by law into the record, those who opposed it had to contest the law in the open, which forced the realm to see its own ugliness. That seeing accelerated the purgation. States may endure corruption for centuries. States cannot endure the spectacle of their law mocked daily by the same lips that pronounce it. He forced the mask to slip in a single season. The healing that required years could not have occurred without his surgery. Into household practices that look trivial, he knitted moral training for future rulers. He insisted that petitions be heard in an order that did not penalize distance, so that a shepherd from Last Hearth was not always displaced by a merchant from Barrowton. He made his sons sit through the tedium of these sessions and then conducted with them a review that treated the people as stakeholders rather than as scenery. When they blanched at the pettiness of certain disputes, he pointed not to the moral outrage but to the costs of bad law. Feuds grow from neglected trifles. Violence grows when a man cannot expect a hearing. Theft grows when scarcity is compounded by procedures that humiliate. In a generation that would be asked to manage scarcity on a civilizational scale, this early sensitivity to prevention rather than cure proved decisive. Sansa's stubborn governance in later winters, Arya's exacting sense of the limits of vengeance, Bran's composure as a node of memory, and Robb's initial competence in aligning marches with supply, each bears in it some residue of those afternoons when a father trained his heirs not to despise their people's smallness. It is an irony worth preserving in the record that the most disruptive thing he did as a father, raising an heir not his son as a son, and burying a name in order to let a man grow where a symbol would have shriveled, produced the least disruption when its truth came to light. The secret could have metastasized into a crisis at any moment in the wrong hands. He contained it not with magic but with habits. He treated the boy as a responsibility, not as a mystery. He did not forge a hidden court for him, nor invite oaths around a claim that would have poisoned the household. He taught him, as he taught all his children, that service precedes privilege. When events dragged the secret into daylight, the house did not splinter around it because the relationships within it had been built on care rather than on claims. The man revealed could be accepted as more than his blood because others had accepted him as more than their lord's whim for years. A secret handled as a duty rather than as a treasure saved the household from itself. When the rebellion slipped from campaign into regime, he practiced the art, rarer than courage and more exhausting than loyalty, of ending a war. He inclined toward restraint in victory without making sanctuaries for impunity. He accepted amnesties where amnesties would bind, and he pushed process where process would signal that the new order meant something other than revenge. In this, he kept Robert from flinging the realm's human wealth onto bonfires for the sake of a clean story. A king desperate to prove rightness with blood too quickly creates scarcity in the only commodity a realm can never import: the steady men who do the work. By interposing himself between a hammer and fresh nails, Eddard preserved useful wood that would later build barricades and ladders where none would have existed had the new regime indulged every appetite under a pretext of justice. In small domestic disputes over lines of foresting, over mill usage, over fishing rights, he preferred negotiated compacts that could survive bad harvests rather than precise legal victories that collapse under stress. For the Umbers and Karstarks, for the Riswells and Hornwoods, this produced mediations that preserved face while distributing cost. None of these settlements made the bards change tunes. They made it possible for later levies to stand side by side without looking over their shoulders for old slights to avenge. The aftermath of his death revealed the value of this pattern. The houses that defected did so out of ambition or terror, not out of a long ledger of personal injuries. Those who remained did so with a composure rare in an age when loyalties flared and dimmed as quickly as candles. In an order built on remembering, he curated what would be remembered about his own house: steadiness, fairness, and a reluctance to waste. Men on grudges. That curation is policy disguised as personality. The practice of progress, the Lord's periodic tours through the hinterlands, was under him not a pageant but a service call. He traveled with craftsmen, scribes, and healers. In his entourage were men who could repair a roof and women who could train midwives as easily as men who could drill a levee. This embedded assistance made his presence a net gain for villages rather than a net cost, which in turn made his summons to arms feel less like expropriation and more like reciprocity. It is in the nature of states that demand must sometimes run ahead of provision. He kept the gap small enough that the cobbler and the miller did not instinctively retreat to the woods at the sight of a banner. Those who underestimate the military value of such goodwill should read the casualty lists from provinces where the Lord's banner is associated with hunger. That association kills armies from within. He did not allow the House Manderley to be bullied into a northern stereotype. He guarded their southern marriages and maritime lets, not because he loved merchants preening, but because he assessed correctly that a north without a rich port is a north at the mercy of southern roads. White Harbor's ships, kept in good repair and often idle by northern standards, existed because he refused to starve a mercantile house of its place in a soldierly culture. In time of need, those ships moved grain and men in a loop that no overland train could have replaced. Had he shamed the Manderleys into provincial self-hatred, they might have been ready to betray in a moment of pique. As it was, they were ready to spend the capital of their pride and wealth in one direction. He did not make them wolves. He made them allies to wolves, which is better than making them liars. His admission of Maester Luwin into council on matters martial was another quiet leverage point. Many lords consult maesters on leeching and letters. Few consult them on march speeds and ration salts. Eddard did, and the papers left by Luwin show calculations of distance and load. How many oats a horse needs to carry its rider and saddle 4 days. How far raven posts ought to be separated for redundancy in winter wind, that later commanders imitated consciously. In a realm with minimal standing staff work, he created a culture of staff function. As a result, the North could plan like a state at moments when others were fought like feuding clans with emblems. It is a fragile distinction in peace and a decisive one in war. Even his aesthetic choices had policy gradients. He kept feasts spare by Southern standards. At first this read as dourness. His children learned to read it as signal. A house that does not normalize extravagance does not humiliate the poor by accident. Men invited to high tables are fed more like neighbors than like subjects reminded of their place by excess. This made alliance with lesser houses easier and lowered the ambient resentment that in other regions must be managed by spectacle or terror. When Sansa later drew nobles and small folk through a winter of rationing with cues and candor rather than with illusions, she was using a language her house had taught by the way it ate when times were fat. The propaganda of frugality paid off in governability. At the Wall, he endorsed the posting of builders and stewards to outlying ruins not as exile but as apprenticeship, a practice Benjen instituted with his blessing. This seeded competence across a frontier that otherwise would have fallen entirely into disrepair. It also built a cohort of men accustomed to independent command under conditions of scarcity, exactly the cohort his bastard son would later harness. Without such antecedent practice, Jon's reforms would have found less purchase. A culture of men who can do a lot with little is not willed into being in a week. It is cultivated by years of being asked to care for what the comfortable forget. When the Greyjoy rebellion broke, Eddard argued for ending it with a seizure of symbols rather than with an extermination of kin. He pressed for the raising of longships and the taking of heirs, not for burning drowned gods' halls or prescribing entire lines to the noose. Even his enemies noted that he avoided arguments with the sea when land fights could suffice. The result was an Iron Islands chastened, not annihilated. A resentful people are manageable when their resentment has a plausible exit in time and status. An annihilated people were that even practical, leave a vacuum into which pirates and adventurers step with no sense of liability to crown or covenant. The islands under his settlement produced raiders later because their culture is a solvent. They did not produce a permanent pirate republic at the realm's doorstep because he left them reasons to prefer taking coin in markets to stealing it in storms. As a husband, he practiced another policy that turned to public good. He treated Lady Catelyn's kin with tenderness while refusing to let his house become a river annex. The balance preserved the alliance without underwriting every Tully quarrel as a stark cause. Thus, when Riverland's houses measured the North's calls for aid, they did not see themselves as being asked to fund a border feud. They saw themselves as partners in a compact where dignity had flowed both ways. It seems pedantic to observe that he never sought to replace every River Lord's steward with his own men. It is, in fact, an administrative revolution. He respected the competency of other houses unless given direct reason not to, which reduced the spread of resentments that metastasize into opportunistic defections in crisis. On the matter of Walder Frey, the bridge lord who would later sully the meaning of guest right, Eddard's record shows a measured patience but not credulity. He paid the tolls and accepted the old man's small slights as the price of crossing a strategic bottleneck without turning the bottle to shards. He neither over-rewarded nor publicly insulted the twins. He treated them as an infrastructure problem within a legal framework. It is unjust to demand that he should have foreseen the abyss the phrase later embraced. It is proper to note that he left the phrase with no fresh slights to dress in as excuses when they performed their villainy. When the realm recoiled at broken bread, there was no second column in the ledger marked stark arrogance to sap the purity of codified outrage. Walder's disgrace was total. The response could be total as well. His tenure as Hand established one more precedent with long half-life, that a regency could be proposed that did not seize the throne under color of urgency. The document naming him protector, composed with Scrivener's neatness and sealed with a dying king's authority, did not constitute force, constituted evidence. When other regencies were later proposed or opposed, men had an example that did not require them to imagine coups as the only technology of transfer. The fact that the paper was ignored in the moment is less important than the fact that it existed and was seen to have existed. States survive in the long run on imagined procedures that become real when enough men act as though they are. Against the charge that he failed to adapt to Southern duplicity, one must place his consistent success in forcing duplicity to overplay its hand. Littlefinger's plots thrived on ambiguity. Eddard's openness turned ambiguity to confession. Cersei Lannister preferred to make crimes and then to dare men to punish her in front of a crowd. Eddard offered her a path to escape without spectacle. She chose spectacle, and in doing so accelerated the very corrosion that would undo her. He could not be expected to change the nature of a court he did not control. By being himself in it, he prevented it from remaining hidden even from itself. The aftershocks of his judicious stubbornness in the East are subtler but just as real. The exile he refused to murder did not subsequently see his house as complicit in her family's obliteration. And so when emissaries crossed the narrow sea seeking common ground, they had ground to stand upon. In bargaining environments where trust is impossible, the absence of specific betrayals functions as trust. That absence is a political asset that cannot be minted in the moment it is required. It must be preserved ahead of time by decisions that will earn only scorn from the impatient. He accrued such assets as a matter of policy. Others spent them when he was gone. No accounting of his masterstrokes should omit the pedagogical economy he practiced with his daughters. Sansa was raised to speak the languages of courtesy and scarcity as though they were dialects of the same tongue. Later, she could ask starving people to endure because she had never been permitted to believe that music and meat are owed to the highborn simply because they ask for them. Arya was taught, often by being permitted to test her limits in measured bursts, that courage without aim becomes cruelty. In an age when vengeance dressed as justice seduced the realm at every turn, she carried a memory of a father who insisted that consequences and calibrations matter more than the thrill of the blow. These are not sentimental attributes. They are technologies of rule. When the two girls later bore responsibilities that would break many men, they did not collapse because their father had trained endurance into them as ordinary virtue. Robb's initial campaigns, so often narrated as streaks of inspiration, rode atop these installed systems. The Great John could be brought to heel in a hall because discipline made spectacle unnecessary. The river commanders could synchronize attacks because they were speaking in a campaign grammar his father had rehearsed with them at weddings and musters for years. Even Robb's fatal error, the marriage that broke a contract with Walder Frey, reads under this light as a departure from house method rather than as proof against it. The toll taken by that breaking teaches the precise lesson his father's life endorses. Promises are cheaper to keep than to repair, and their interest rate in blood is usurious. Benjen Stark's watch, conducted with the benefit of Eddard's supply policy and the alignment of Winterfell with Castle Black's practical needs, seeded relationships that later bore unlikely fruit. An unlettered giant treating Stark banners as kin, wildling chieftains prepared to hear a treatise on gates and grazing from a boy who spoke the old god's parsimony without condescension. None of this miracles itself into being. It grows from a soil turned and fertilized by a lord who placed higher value on sturdy customs than on brittle pride. The customs outlived the man. They made possible a fusion of peoples that had previously known each other only as shadows beyond a wall. Even in death, his procedural imprint argued against the logic of spectacle. The heads that decorated the city walls to frighten waverers did not terrify everyone the same. In the north, where a lord's willing submission to law was praised, his end registered not as a warning but as a summons. The Watchers did not see the crown's power. They saw the crown's treachery. The difference determined whether men sat down or saddled up. Those who rode did so under a banner that in their minds flew for process as much as for blood. This conceptual distinction, repudiating the capital's childish conflation of victory with theatrical cruelty, kept the Northern War from degenerating into a spree of arson that would have sown salt into alliances long before crops could grow again. Even in rage, the North fought like a house trained to expect harvest after war. The simple fact that his children could remain coherent personalities under pain, loss, and astonishing opportunity owes to a rhythm learned at Winterfell, the rhythm of duties that recur regardless. As of mood, a person trained to do what must be done because it must be done will not err much when asked to choose between adulation and a cold calculation of what keeps people alive. Eddard's discipline was the monastery where later saints learned not holiness but habit. Habit saved more lives than holiness around the long tables of a starving castle. A critic might argue that none of this adds up to saving the realm, until one draws a diagram combining his personal decency with the arrival of impossible allies and the confluence of prophecies, kingsmoots, and castles. That critic would thereby confess his own addiction to single causes. The realm was not saved by an event. It was saved by a topology of decisions that kept corridors open and doors unlocked, that kept temperaments sweet and grudges small, that kept ledgers accurate enough that when ruin came, men knew what they had to spend and what they dared to risk. He could not conjure dragons. He nourished the only creature whose power is reliably grown, the trust of communities in their own endurance when ordered by competence. The choice to keep feast days modest, the insistence that men who winter in outforts receive their pay on the earlier date in the ledger when roads are still passable, the rotation of young squires through ravencoats to learn the temperament of birds and the vulnerabilities of messages, the habit of sending a second courier with bad news so that the first failure does not isolate a remote hold in ignorance, the rule that carts requisitioned for campaigns are returned with repairs rather than with excuses, the ordinance that guessed right is a civil sacrament and not merely a superstition. The scholar balks at calling these masterstrokes. Yet, in the summation they eclipse the angrier, louder choices of his day. Each represents the refusal to push a cost forward into someone else's future. Each made the collapse of trust less likely. Their aggregate created the cushion by which great shocks did not automatically become fatal. In the capital he left behind, he still contrived to salt the ground against another generation of courtiers' favorite pastime, the conflation of cleverness with wisdom. The letters that survive from his shorthandship reflect neither wit nor flair. They reflect an office that tried to make the city governable by reminding it that the river does not care for jokes, that bakers cannot be paid with promises, that even the brothels require peace to collect their fees. Those reminders were repugnant to men who enjoy feeling essential because they make essential things complicated. Eddard made essential things simple and therefore threatened an entire class of parasites. That class triumphed over him in the short term. In the longer term, it met its match in scarcity. The city abandoned by his kind of hand learned in weeks what he had tried to teach it in days. There is nothing political about bread until there is no bread, at which point everything is political and the politician is often the first to starve. In the East, those who had catalogued the crimes of the usurper's regime did not catalog Stark among them. In that Stannis's late rescue found northern men not yet exhausted by earlier waste is partly the result of this headache of restraint. It is unfashionable. It is survival. One more thread completes the tapestry of his unseen measures. Memory curated with care. Eddard tolerated bards so long as they sang without rewriting law. He preferred archivists. He paid scribes to maintain copies of old treaties and to annotate them with the dates and conditions under which they had been observed or ignored. He required stewards to report not only yields but weather anomalies and animal diseases. He quietly funded Cranigman storytellers to commit to parchment versions of their oral maps of the next shifting channels. Archival description is the least stirring of acts. It made possible, in later campaigns and settlements, the avoidance of mistakes that feel new because men do not know how old they are. There is hardly a more powerful masterstroke than preventing men in power from believing themselves geniuses when they are merely ignorant of their grandfathers. That the North could accept a king and then, when needed, accept the end of kings without convulsions owes to his liturgy of practicality. He did not make sovereignty a sacrament. He made duty one. Sovereignty can move between icons so long as the altar remains in place. When a last king in the North broke upon vows laid too hastily and fires lit too soon, the altar did not topple. The brothers and sisters who stepped to it afterward, bearing names that clang against each other in the mouth, found a faith in the room that did not require their own pedigrees to be polished. That faith came from years when a lord did not skip market day hearings and did not overdraw the granary in summer. What, in the end, makes a masterstroke? The chronicler, if he is honest, must answer that it is any act whose benefit compounds across contexts, bound to no single outcome but available to many. Eddard Stark's choices meet that definition with a steady hand. He built processes that retained value when men broke. He preserved options for negotiations not yet imagined. He taught heirs to hear their people and to accept pain without melodrama. He raised the floor of acceptable government and lowered the ceiling of plausible despotism. The realm survived not because it was lucky but because its luck could be used. He made the use of luck possible. If there is a final frame in this supercut of quiet blows, it shows a timberline under snow. Somewhere beneath, sap still moves. Somewhere above, wind clarifies the outlines of trees that will leaf if they are spared. Eddard Stark governed like the man who inspects the trunks in summer and orders the thinning that prevents a winter fire from racing unchecked. No one applauds the thinning. The spared forest is applause enough. He never saw the spring that followed the longest winter. He made it legible to those who did.